Welcome back to the Lions247 Podcast, episode 2 this week. I am Tyler Donahue, and here in Happy Valley, you can feel it in the air. Quite literally, it is football weather outside right now. We're lingering in the 60s on a Thursday morning. The students are swarming back to campus over the course of this week and through the weekend, and the energy is certainly intensifying here in State College. Just 9 days out of 2025 season kickoff between the Nittany Lions and Nevada and Beaver Stadium, a couple Saturdays away. We will be in the press box, our new press box in Beaver Stadium that afternoon to bring you all the latest coverage. We were back on the practice field this week for our final peek at Penn State's preseason camp, which wraps up, now shifting focus toward game preparation and the season that awaits. We're going to bring on board Daniel Gallo now, who was on that field with me, along with Mark and Grace Brendan. A bunch of content over at linemen247.com since we were on the field on Tuesday afternoon into Tuesday evening. Full press conference with James Franklin, full photo gallery, complete practice notebooks on offense and defense, and a lot more. We're going to get into a lot of those notes and nuggets over the course of this podcast. And just to make people aware, we are shifting into in-season mode here on our podcast schedule next week. We're going to have a weekly Monday press conference with James Franklin that will come out of and bring you the latest notes from. We'll also have a chance to check in with the opposing intel as we check in with a beat reporter from the team that Penn State will be playing that week. And we'll bring on Tyler Calvaruso, especially for home matchups, to get a sense of the kind of recruiting opportunity that Penn State will have for all these matchups inside Beaver Stadium. And of course, you'll get our predictions each week and a lot of the storylines and inside notes about Penn State as they get ready for kickoff on a weekly basis. But here, our focus stays on preseason camp and what we learned coming out of it. We've got a few positions we're going to hit pretty hard on this episode. We've got quarterback, we've got safety, we've got tight end, we've got the defensive line. So plenty to get to Daniel, and we're just about filled our notebooks for preseason camp. We kind of get a fresh start with game week next week. But I know about you, I'm ready to see these guys play against someone in a different jersey. I'm sure they feel the same way.
Definitely. And you talk about how it feels a little bit more like football season out there. I took a day trip down to the Philly suburbs yesterday, and I was at one of the higher elevations on the drive out of State College, saw the thermometer in my car get down to 62 degrees. I wasn't sure if we were going to get into the 50s, but to me that was a sign that we are, we're almost in it now, and I'm very excited.
Yeah, we'll be in that press box pretty soon. We'll see what it looks like, the new amenities for us in Beaver Stadium. But we got a lot to get to here on this show regarding the Nittany Lions. And I think we can begin with quarterback observations. This time around this week, Daniel, you had your focus on offense. I was over on the defensive field. I have some things to share, but we want to start at quarterback because James Franklin told us after that Tuesday practice that his staff is close to making a decision on who will be Penn State's primary backup QB behind senior Drew Aller entering the season. In the past, we've heard from James Franklin on this subject saying it could be a week-to-week kind of competition during the season through the fall. Wasn't getting that vibe from him. In fact, he said they were close to determining a backup quarterback about a week ago. Then there was some inconsistency, a couple spans of practice where they didn't feel as comfortable with that decision. Now they're back to feeling more comfortable. Daniel, I don't know when we will officially learn who QB2 is. I'm sure that's a conversation that's going to be had internally ahead of this practice week and preparing for game one. But what did you see on the field, and what can you maybe glean from what you saw?
I think the one thing that was the most indicative of the way the depth chart is stacking up right now is there's a segment in practice that we've seen before where a center, a quarterback, and a running back get together. And I think earlier in camp, we would see it, and it would be Drew Aller with Nick Dawkins and Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. I think that's pretty clear who that is. And then the second group would have both Jackson Smolik and Ethan Grunkemeyer with either Venga Ioane, Cooper Cousins. When we saw them divide into that group on Tuesday night, it was Drew Aller and Ethan Grunkemeyer together with, I think Cooper Cousins was snapping to them, and then Singleton, Allen, and Cam Wallace, and I think Tyke Hayes was there too in that first group. And then the second group was Jackson Smolik with Jack Lambert and the walk-on running backs taking snaps from Venga Ioane. Beckham Kritza wasn't present during our viewing window on Tuesday night. And so to me, seeing this is the second straight practice window where we've seen Aller and Grunkemeyer together going through a specific drill while Smolik is off with a different group doing a drill. So I think reading between the lines there, knowing how we know that, Penn State does things, how they divide things up, who they want to get reps with whom. I think that gives you a little bit of a window into what this could look like. Personally for me, I think maybe we'll know on Wednesday night, if Jackson Smolik is in a scout team jersey. I think that'll be an indication of, potentially where this is going. And then I'm sure that certainly by Saturday, when they really line up in the order of the depth and they go through things in pregame warmups, I think that'll really give us a window into how this shook out.
Yeah, and this is a big decision. We talked about it before, not just because you're discussing who's next up behind Drew Aller against Nevada or Florida International, but who might be next up, big picture, beyond Drew Aller, who is his days are. I mean, he might have 17 more games to play. He might not here at a Penn State uniform, but his days are numbered here with the Nittany Lions as a senior. And so you start to imagine what happens next. We floated out the possibility, might this be the offseason where Penn State takes a peek at the transfer portal more realistically at quarterback? Well, it's really up to Ethan Grunkemeyer and Jackson Smolik to kind of prove that they don't need to take that course of action. And like we said, because of the non-conference schedule, the way we think that these games will flow for the Nittany Lions, there should be some advantageous reps for whoever is QB2. I do wonder, Daniel, though, because it sounds like there is going to be a preseason decision on this rather than an in-season competition, unless the coaching staff reverses course here in the next few days. Does that eliminate opportunities for whoever is QB3, or do they still make a concerted effort to get them some film, get them some throws and game action before you get to that September bye week?
I could definitely see that happening, especially depending on how out of hand things get over the course of these games. I know that Mark made the comment where you look at these 3 games and the way that we are talking about them really feels like it's no disrespect to Nevada, FIU, or Villanova. And I know that Villanova can bring up some painful memories for some people back in 2021. But it really does look like that Penn State, the way that this team is constructed is, really going to have some big leads, and then they're really going to have the chance to empty the bench and get these guys looks, and they really do need to get them looks. I think that beyond getting the QB3 in there, maybe to get them film, maybe to keep them happy, all those things. Yeah, I do think that you need to play that QB3 because, down the depth chart positions, like those are fluid throughout the season. So I think that over the course of the year, you want to see how guys are developing, where they're improving, are they regressing? Maybe there was something that they couldn't do well at the end of camp that by the time you get to week 8, week 9, they've really improved there. When we know that James Franklin talks about it, like the most competitive environment in college football, and they really do evaluate every single thing. So I do think that maybe more this year than we've seen in the past. Maybe you do get to the QB3 because when Bo Prabula was the backup, it was the Bo Prabula show in mop-up duty. Jackson Smolik got like 2 snaps because Prabula had a cut he had to get attended to. And then Grunkemeyer never got a snap when Prabula was on the roster last year. I do think that might look a little bit different. At the same time, Grunkemeyer's got to get the QB2 is going to have to get reps too, no matter who that is.
Yeah, one of the interesting subplots as we continue to disrespect Penn State's first 3 opponents on the 2025 schedule. But Daniel, I think it'll be fascinating because we want to see what these guys look like with some live bullets. Even if you're going up against an overmatched team who's been beaten down and is trailing by 40 points, you just want to get a sense for how they can direct traffic out there, taking the information from the coaches, disseminating it to their teammates, getting up to the line, and executing. And that's just one of those things where it's great to do it on the practice field. You can look sharp out there, but get in front of a Beaver Stadium crowd with all the cameras on you, just a little bit of a different feel. And I think we'll start to kind of learn more about both these guys, certainly one of these guys over the course of the next few weeks at quarterback. Daniel, when we look at running back, our conversation last week, if people kind of picked up on that last Thursday, we mentioned 3 of those competitors for RB3 were not on the practice field last week. And James Franklin kind of indicated that has been a bit of an issue for them. Availability, the consistency of getting to see these guys out there shoulder to shoulder competing for the job. This is definitely a competition that I think we have anticipated will go into September because of the opportunities they'll get in non-conference play. And also, I just don't think Stan Drayton needs to rush this decision with what he has at the top of the pecking order with Katron Allen and Nick Singleton. But the question becomes, Daniel, next week when we get back on the practice field, and there's guys aren't all wearing their uniforms like we have seen in preseason camp. We're going to see the scout team form. And if you go to the scout team, there's a strong chance you're going to remain on the scout team through Thanksgiving. James Franklin told us a couple of days ago, guys have worked their way from the scout team to have game opportunities and game roles later in their season. But which running backs, when we get out there next week, are going to be still in that same uniform, in line behind Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, and which of them are going to be wearing the uniform numbers of Nevada running backs and working with the backups? I think that's going to be telling for us, because whoever is getting that varsity work on the practice field tells you, at least entering the season, they're trying to load those guys up with playbook opportunities and probably some late game series.
Yeah, I think you look at this, and the availability, it seems like, has been a really key point for James Franklin and Stan Drayton when you look at this competition. I know we talked about it last week where we didn't see Cam Wallace, Quentin Martin, or Corey Smith during the practice viewing window. This week, we did see all three of them. And Franklin mentioned it's been inconsistent in terms of availability, which can make some of these decisions pretty difficult. Like the best ability is availability, as they say. But I do think that this is the running back position battle is always unique because it's that position. We talked about this. We talk about this every year when it looks like there's a million mouths to feed in the backfield, and it's like you can play multiple guys. You can use them in different situations. I think especially with what Nick Singleton and Katron Allen have accomplished in their careers, I do think that Penn State is going to be very cognizant of their workloads and getting them healthy to December so that you have them at full strength for the playoff run. We saw what they could do when they're at full strength in a playoff run last year. So I think that the RB3 battle, I think it's one of those ones that more so than quarterback, it can look very different week to week and very different over the course of the season, depending on, game plan, scheme, opponent, and then just the factor of how guys are practicing. But I think when you look at it now, I think Cam Wallace has looked really good in our glimpses of him at practice, which, we were really curious about given the injuries that he suffered last year. I think Quentin Martin is just, your imagination goes a little bit in terms of how you can use him in different ways, use that receiving ability. And then, Stan Drayton said earlier this month that Corey Smith is the most elusive back in the room. And that your imagination can kind of go with that too, especially based on what we saw him do in that Washington game last year. And then on top of that, you have the freshmen Tyke Hayes and Jabri Coleman, both of whom have gotten a lot of praise early on in their careers. So it's really interesting. And, I do think that the scout team numbers at running back, that's an easy one because there's only so many guys, and where they line up at practice, they're right there in front of us. So we know right away, who's up, who's down. But I'm very curious to see what this looks like. And I think this one is one that could change over the course of the year.
And so to see that more robust competition, everybody was back involved this week, except then we didn't see Jabri Coleman, the newcomer. But I don't think we've been really fully putting him in this conversation as someone who's going to be RB3 in September. We'll see what Coleman can do on the practice field this year. He was a summer arrival. I think the conversation really comes down to, I don't expect to see Cam Wallace is going to be wearing number 26 next week when we get out there. He will be with the varsity team. Is he RB3? I don't know, but I know that he has shaken off a lot of the mental and physical issues that he had to deal with coming off of a significant injury. The question for me becomes, is it 2 out of the 3? Is it 1 out of 3? Is it all 3 between Tyke Hayes, Quentin Martin, and Corey Smith? I feel like with Quentin Martin's versatility, what we've heard about him as a special teams piece, he'll be wearing his 25. He'll be part of that conversation. Is that breakaway threat with Corey Smith? We heard he didn't have the best scrimmage when they got into Beaver Stadium. How has that been all balanced out? And then with Tyke Hayes, has he shown enough since that winter enrollment? We liked what we've seen about him. He runs with physicality. He's pretty fearless for a freshman. Has he done enough to put himself in the conversation to play some game action? And there's just only so many carries to go around with that beyond Singleton and Allen, but we do expect there to be several of them available in non-conference action. So we'll see where it's at. We'll pick that up next week, but something to monitor as that group was more complete during our latest look at them, and that's good news for Stan Drayton. Daniel, when we look over at the offensive line, whoever's carrying the ball this year should be running behind a very formidable offensive line all season long, but we still have some things to work out there. Big part of that question mark is right guard. That's where Anthony Donko has been getting a lot of reps. He's been getting some at right tackle, continuing to work there, but Nolan Rucci seems to be the guy there right now. Cooper Cousins, who for a long time we figured would be the primary right guard as a sophomore, is involved there. And then James Franklin made it a point to pull another name into that conversation with us a couple nights ago on the practice field, TJ Shanahan, who started 5 games at guard for Texas A&M last season. He's a redshirt sophomore who transferred in during the winter, former top 24/7 prospect. Figured he's going to be a utility piece, a backup piece, but James Franklin felt he needed to mention him involved there. So he says Nolan Rucci's presence and performance is going to be part of that conversation. I think that means that if Nolan Rucci's killing it at right tackle, Donko is going to be part of that right guard conversation. If Rucci is struggling maybe, or they feel like they want to get Donko more action there, then maybe that opens up and clears things more for a guy like Cousins or TJ Shanahan at guard. But this is still working itself out. This is a really good problem to have for Phil Trautwein. What do you make of where we're at in terms of the context of this offensive line? Because we've been naming a lot of names for this group for a while, and it feels like we're starting to narrow our focus on who's actually going to be part of the primary plan, at least going into the season.
Definitely. I thought it was interesting that James Franklin brought up TJ Shanahan, especially because I think that he's someone that we were in a little bit of a wait and see mode with, especially the feedback that we got from the spring when he arrived based on where he was physically after his time at Texas A&M and the work that Chuck Losey and company had to do once they got him on campus. So I think that once again, the fact that Shanahan is now in this conversation, another compliment to Chuck Losey and his staff for the offseason work they do with their development. But yeah, I mean, it is really interesting, and I think that some of this is a huge compliment to Anthony Donko, where Franklin is basically being like, you could either be the best right guard or the best right tackle on our roster, depending on how other people are playing. And I think that that speaks to the rise that Donka's had and just his development since he's gotten on campus. You talk about that offensive line class of 2023. He was the lowest rated recruit, of that group. He was in there with a 5-star and another top 24/7 guy who started the cycle in that 5-star range. So I think that's a testament to Donko and Phil Trautwein for that development there. But yeah, I mean, it is, I would be really interested to see, like what this competition looks like when we're not there, when they are in the, the contact periods, the scrimmages, what this fight looks like when all these different guys are on the field, because we know the play personalities of these guys, like someone like Cooper Cousins, is pretty mean when he gets out there, and he wants to be out there, and he wants to show that he deserves to be out there. It's going to be really interesting to see, and I am interested in, like, we talk a lot about the rotations, and last year Donko wasn't in a rotation at right tackle with Rucci. You'd see Rucci here and there, but it wasn't a true rotation like we've seen at other spots. Vanga Ioane seems really entrenched at left guard, and you're not going to take him off the field. So it really does narrow things down into this right guard spot. And how many guys can you play? How much can you play them? It's quite the juggling act, I think, for Phil Trautwein to see how this works. So it's going to be really intriguing to follow along with as things keep going.
One name that we mentioned early in preseason camp that we're not mentioning now at right guard as often is Javen Williams. He spent a lot of time at right tackle this spring with Nolan Rucci and Anthony Donko sideline. He was the primary right tackle in the blue-white game for the first team offense, but focus landed for him at right guard. Unfortunately, about a week into camp, we started seeing him pop up with a club on his hand and his wrist. And so clearly he's dealing with something there. It's not easy to navigate a 305-pound defensive tackle when you got a club on your hand. So that's a disadvantage right there. But for James Franklin to mention 3 guys involved at right guard and to not bring up Javen Williams, that's not where you want to be right now, but we still have more to learn. And you kind of reminded me, he might be just viewed as a swing everything right now for this team. A guy who can play tackle. We know he's done that in the past. A guy who can play guard. Former 5-star prospect in year 3. Again, this probably has more to do with the health of this offensive line room, what they have at the top of this depth chart. But he's a guy that we can't forget about, but seems like maybe in August that he had hoped to come out the other end in a better spot for Javen Williams. But there's so many guys in this offensive line room that came with highly credentialed recruiting backgrounds that have had to wait their turn. And we talked about how a few years ago, if they showed up to campus, they would have had to been flung into the fire because of what happened there. So Phil Troutwine, not a bad thing to have a pipeline where guys aren't feeling the pressure, but there certainly is a sense of urgency when you're on year 3. I talked about that with Javen earlier this month, and he's somebody we'll progress. We'll follow his progression as this campaign moves on. Going over to linebacker, which is a spot I spent a lot of time watching this week on the practice field. I think we're getting a better sense of where things stand there, not only from who's at the top of the depth chart, but maybe who's starting to form that potential 2 deep. I don't know if Jim Knowles would say he has a firm 2 deep that he trusts right now and he feels fully great about, but I think we start to know who those names are, who those faces are. Saw a couple different pairings on the defensive practice field on Tuesday. The first was Dom DeLuca and Tony Rojas working at linebacker. That was with what appeared to me as probably the projected first team back 7 on defense. The next 2 linebackers we saw up in a different unit was Amari Campbell, the transfer from North Carolina, and he was next to Keon Wiley, who missed last season with an injury, and in the box linebacker in year 4 here on campus. Now, beyond those guys, Anthony Specca, Alex Tash, the freshman, the redshirt freshman, they're probably rounding out that top 6 along with Keon Wiley. We know there's a top 3 with Campbell, Rojas, and DeLuca. And then some others that I think we'll just be seeing. Again, will they win in scout team jerseys? Will they be special teams pieces? Will they have a defensive role as this year goes on? Dakari Nelson, who converted from safety last year and ended up starting the Big Ten opener with Don DeLuca sidelined with an injury, but really was not a relevant defensive factor beyond that. Key special teams piece, but not at linebacker last year. He's now in year 3 on campus, former top 24/7 guy. Kari Jackson, who missed all of last season with an injury as a freshman. LeVar Arrington and Cam Smith, who are true freshmen. Arrington's been around since last winter. Smith was a summer arrival. But we talked about this position for a while, and the urgency that you want to feel like you can get to kickoff or at least get to Big Ten and say, these are our top 6. And this is how we feel comfortable with it. Last week, Jim Knowles didn't express a lot of comfort, but Daniel, we're getting close. These guys are going to get a lot of run to prove whether they belong or don't belong. What do you make of how things are trending right now at linebacker? What's your comfort level with this group? Because we've been nitpicking a potential national championship contender all offseason long, and it's just about time to be done with that assessment.
Yeah, we're really breaking down this roster, and it's all like QB2, RB3, LB4. Like it really shows. I know there's some other positions on this roster to really keep an eye on, but it is pretty funny like where we're starting all this focus, and says a lot about this team. I think when you look at linebacker, I do think that you do want to get into that like 5-6 number, just because you want to steel yourself against injuries as you go over the course of this year. You never know what's going to happen. Like, DeLuca got hurt last year, and then fortunately for Penn State, it was an injury that he could eventually play with as the season went on when he had the big cast on his thumb. But I think that Wiley is really interesting here because it feels like he's really just on that fringe. Last week Knowles talked about being really comfortable with that top 3. And it feels like that given his experience, given his age, how long he's been around the program, it seems like that if he can take a step, if he feels on the cusp of maybe joining that top group, especially when you look at some of the orders that guys go through drills with. I think Specca and Tash, like the upside there is really tantalizing in terms of how can they play, what can they bring. I think that given how Penn State likes to redshirt guys, I think that Tash, if he is that LB6, probably see him here and there throughout the season. And then when you get into postseason, then he's maybe someone that you're able to let loose a little bit more. But I think that overall, I think that you feel like cautiously good about this group. I think that there are some things that you are, hoping that you hope that Tony Rojas being completely healthy helps his game overall in terms of what he's able to do. You hope that Amari Campbell has played a ton of football in a different conference that, coming to here where the Big Ten is a little bit different. You are maybe banking a little bit that it is a smooth transition. But this will be a group that when you get in the non-conference play, I can really see them cycling through guys because I think DeLuca and Rojas, you really know what you have. I feel like the coaching staff, maybe they feel like they know what they have in Campbell. I think we've never seen him in 11-on-11 action in a Penn State uniform, so we don't really know exactly what they have in him. But I think that you can really see them cycle through guys to figure out what these guys can do, on Saturdays when the lights are on.
Yeah, Campbell projects as a key transfer pickup. There's certainly a few of them in the receiver room, and we got a little bit more feedback from James Franklin on how things are going for those three newcomers. Not so new anymore. Trevor Pena showed up in the summer, but talk about Devontae Ross and Kyron Hudson. They've been around since the winter. He says Hudson is steady Eddie. We've heard so much about his reliability and contested catches, the rapport that him and Drew Aller have been able to develop through their time together on campus thus far. He says Pena, and he's really hammered this home to us at every opportunity, Pena is exceeding their expectations, which were already sky high when you talk about bringing in a guy who accomplished what he did last year within Syracuse's offense. He is faster. He is more explosive. He has a great feel for the offense, and he's doing what they expected him to do, and perhaps even a little bit more. And then the story on Devontae Ross, more of the same vibes we've heard on him really since he made his move to Troy and made some athletic strides with Chuck Losey. James Franklin says, quote, he scares some people in space. And so I don't know if Penn State has had a lot of guys like that in recent year who scare people in space, whether it's short yardage or down the field. And so, again, everything is adding up that Penn State went 3 for 3 on this, and we got to see it check out in game action. You were watching these receivers closely. Ours our final look during preseason camp. Obviously, there's plenty of other players that we're going to be focusing on at this position room over the course of the fall, except for these three guys. But it starts with them. The conversation starts with them, Daniel. So what are you picking up from another opportunity to get a few yards away from them, watch them go to work?
Pena is really, really smooth out there on the field, and I do think it is, interesting to hear James Franklin really hammer home the exceeding expectations thing, because I think from the outside, the expectations for him were already, sky high. Like, this is the guy that a lot of people wanted to see in a Penn State uniform once he entered the transfer portal. His numbers at Syracuse last year, especially when you put them alongside what Penn State wide receivers have done over the past couple of years. Like, that's what you want on your roster. That's what I think people feel like Penn State needed on its roster. But I do think that you had some questions in terms of coming to a different program, a different offense. I made the joke last week about the numbers that different people could put up in that Syracuse passing offense with Kyle McCord. And so to have that be here, because they've talked a lot about, they want proven production. They wanted guys who produce to come. But we all know that production isn't created equally in terms of what Devontae Ross did against Sunbelt competition, what Trevor Pena did in a very pass-happy offense, and then what Kyron Hudson did in the Big Ten last year and in the Pac-12 before that. So I do think that even though you are bringing in these guys that produced, there still is a level of, okay, we have to see what that looks like against our Penn State secondary, which is a very difficult unit to go against. So I think that that's been a little illuminating when you look at what these guys can actually do when they get on the field, a little bit beyond what we've been projecting or maybe assuming what they can bring. In terms of watching practice, I really like watching Kyron Hudson practice. The way he goes about things, you can tell also that he's very comfortable in that vocal role. We've seen guys who talk a lot at practice before, but a lot of times these wide receivers, they're not really talking to anyone. They're, it's kind of a running commentary on what they're doing or maybe some other things. But Hudson actually banters, with Marcus Hagans, with James Urban, with James Franklin even. There's a real back and forth there, and it's been really interesting to see. And I think it offers a little bit of a look into his personality and what he brings to this room, and the type of guy he is. We've heard only good things about him from that perspective. So that's been another layer onto this, and something fun to keep an eye on during practice.
Switching back over to defense, James Franklin said that not only is Xavier Gilliam taking a big step during this preseason camp as a redshirt freshman, but he is actually pushing to potentially start at defensive tackle alongside Zane Durant. Now, we've had Senior Alonzo Ford, he's a sixth-year college competitor, previously at Old Dominion, transferred here a few years ago. We've had him penciled in for a while next to Zane Durant, especially once he was cleared for full go practice after missing the end of last season and spring ball. He still really stayed that course. Jim Knowles continues to say good things about Alonzo Ford. But Knowles last week said beyond those top two guys that to him, the defensive tackle standing out most was Xavier Gilliam. And so for James Franklin to piggyback off that and now say he's pushing for a starting role, we're listening intently when it comes to this young defensive tackle. He's up to about 305 pounds right now. He enrolled around 260. He was an all-county basketball player in Maryland at about 230, 235 pounds. They trusted their read on him for a long time. He was a defensive end at the high school level at Quince Orchard, and he played opposite of Jalen Harvey, who was also part of that 2024 class. They did some damage together. But I remember speaking with Alan Zamitis, former All-American defensive back here for the Nittany Lions. Now he's a recruiting coordinator on signing day after they landed him. And he said the first thing is just watch how he carries his weight. And he says he's gonna put on weight, and you're not even gonna realize he's at that kind of a weight right now. They projected that a long time ago. They've seen it come to fruition. And I'll tell you what, he said he got some help from the mac and cheese bar here at Penn State that helped him put on some weight. But he has not lost his athleticism from really what we have seen. And that was such a mainstay cornerstone of what he was as a recruit, the basketball court athleticism, some of what he was able to do off the edge. And spoke with Deion Barnes a bit right after we heard from James Franklin, because, that's obviously want to bring that comment over to him. And he said, yeah, he is a, quote, technician against the run right now. Full trust in Xavier Gilliam's ability to read blocks and dictate what he needs to fill rushing lanes and to get that traffic away. He also says that the athleticism that they knew he had as a former edge rusher, as a former basketball player, shows up in that pass rush. So they feel like they've got a real balanced guy. I also picked Nick Dawkins' brain earlier in preseason camp because I had a feeling we'd be hearing more about Xavier Gilliam as August went on. Nick Dawkins, who I'll trust his judgment on members of this roster as well as anybody, called him a workout warrior. And he said that his dedication to the weight room and to the offseason steps is incomparable. And so to hear that about a young player, the word incomparable about what the effort he's putting in from someone like Nick Dawkins says a lot. And so this is a guy who's made a lot of fans in the building in a hurry. He was viewed as playable last season, burnable in terms of that red shirt. They didn't need to do it because of the veteran presences they had at defensive tackle, and they kept things pretty tight with that rotation in the postseason. So we haven't seen a lot of Xavier Gilliam. I think we've seen fewer than 60 total snaps. But Daniel, he is emerging as a real presence on this defensive line, and he could be a bit of a game changer when we talk about what this team can do on the interior if he's going to be that much of a threat. And you have a really solid top three at DT with guys like Owen Wayful, perhaps Anai White, Ty Blanding, working their way up and filling out the rotation. Feeling pretty good about defensive tackle right now, and what we hear about Xavier Gilliam makes me feel even better.
You go back to when we talked to him in February in that first-year player availability, and he said that he knew there was an opportunity for him, and he wanted to go get it. I forget if his exact quote was "the time is now" or what exactly it was, but that was the sentiment that he was putting out there. Going in the spring ball, I think that he'd gotten his feet wet. He knew what the depth chart situation was with all those guys leaving, and he also knew what the team needed from him that in that depth chart situation. So I think to see him go in there, and it seems like he's really attacked things and made good on it. When you talk about him pushing for a starting job, maybe you can look at this similar to cornerback, where you have the one guy who is like the All-American caliber player in Zane Durant, like AJ Harris is out there, and then the spot next to him can rotate a little bit. But then by the time you get to the end, they've all played similar reps in there. Maybe it can be a little bit of a co-starter situation there, kind of like what we saw last year in the playoff with Ford, Izzard, and Durant, Izzard, and Devontae Thomas.
Daniel, I could see, and we document snaps on a weekly basis, so we'll have a good look at this. But I think that I could see Ford starting, but then when you look at the snap counts, Gilliam being the number 2 guy on those snap counts. I think it could be one of those kind of scenarios.
Exactly. Yeah, I can see that too. And like a thing where it's like maybe Durant, if theoretically like Durant would be at like 75 and then % or whatever, and then Ford and Gilliam would both be at like 50 or around there. But yeah, I mean, I think that we've talked about it a lot, that we're doing a lot of projection when we talk about this team, even though there's a lot coming back and a lot of really important players who are going to play big roles. There are all these spots up and down the roster where, we're looking at someone's recruiting pedigree, early feedback on them as a freshman, what we've seen from them in their physical development. And then we're saying, okay, we think this guy can step up and play a big role. I think we've had Gilliam in that category going back to like December and January when we really started thinking about 2025. And to see that he is making good on that, I think it gives us a little bit more clarity. Maybe it's still a projection, but I think it takes away a little bit of the projection. And hey, cut him loose in the non-con. Let's see what he can do.
If the conversation was, hey, we feel really good about these two seniors in Alonzo Ford and Zane Durant, and then we got a lot to figure out with the other guys, they're coming along, that would concern you. But it's not that. It feels like you've got kind of this bridge guy in Xavier Gilliam who's further along, but you also got, speaking with Deion Barnes, they think Owen Wafel is kind of a sneaky good pass rusher. They really like the way he reads the run too. We've talked about it before. His ability to be compact and quick with his body type stands out to them. And Ty Blanning is someone that they feel like they're able to turn him loose. I think particularly in pass situations. I wonder if Ty Blanning could be a bit of a specialist in that regard. And same deal with Gilliam. If you're in more of an obvious passing down, is it as simple as, Alonzo get to the sideline, Xavier get out there, and we know what Zane Durant can do in terms of getting in the backfield and getting after a quarterback. But it feels like Deion Barnes has some nice pieces to work with at defensive tackle. They're unproven to this point, but they're not going to be as unproven once we get to Big Ten play because of what they've got coming up early in the schedule. Kind of buried the buzz here a little bit, but we let off the last time we were on with me, Daniel, on Chaz Coleman. When we saw the first team defensive line, or what we would think would be the first team defensive line, putting in some work on the field Tuesday afternoon, Tuesday evening, it was Zane Durant and Alonzo Ford inside. It was Deni Dennis Sutton outside. And then opposite of him, Chaz Coleman, 3 weeks into his college career with a first team defensive line for the number 2 team in college football. Just normal stuff. But people are probably wondering where the hell is Zariah Fisher. Did follow up with that on Deion Barnes. He says he's fine. He says he's going to be okay. As you'd imagine, they're going to be careful with Zariah Fisher. And so he wasn't on the practice field this Tuesday, but we'll take a look next week. We're on the practice field. Again, nothing from Deion Barnes indicating that this is going to be something that moves, it extends further and into the season. But Zariah Fisher has played, I think, 15 of the last 42 Nittany Lions games because of injury issues. So you got to count on some depth, and it's going to be young depth. And sure seems like Chaz Coleman is starting to put himself toward the top of that pecking order. And Deion Barnes raved about him, talked about how rare it is for him to come in and have such a sense for the game. He brought up an anecdote where they were going through some action and he made a mistake. Coleman made a mistake. He was supposed to do something off the edge on that particular play. He did not do it. He went to the sideline. Barnes was on the other side of the field, so they didn't have a chance to kind of get together and correct it together. But he said a couple plays later, it's the same scenario. And he saw Coleman apply the correction on his own before they had a chance to talk. They get back together in the meeting room later, and Deion's like, "Did you correct that on yourself?" And he said, "Yeah." Chaz said, "I knew what I was doing wrong, and so I figured I could apply that." He says Chaz Coleman texts him after practices if he feels like he had a bad practice to apologize. He said after good practices, Chaz Coleman wants to go and review the film to find out how he can get better. Deion Barnes basically indicated, this is a freshman who showed up willing to do every single little thing it takes to get his feet on the field on Saturdays. Sounds like he has put himself in a tremendous position to do that. Good things about Malachi Williams and Jalen Harvey and what they're doing as redshirt freshmen. It sounds like Deion Barnes views them as ascending figures. Ivan Kamaju, the other freshman, is still in that conversation as well. But I'll tell you what, Daniel, I'm going to write a story about it today, what Deion Barnes said about Chaz Coleman. And Deion Barnes is usually relatively low-key and can kind of describing his players and breaking things down. His eyes are wide open when it comes to Chaz Coleman in a way that was similar to what we heard and what we kind of felt from James Franklin last week when he was discussing the freshman edge rusher.
Yeah, the hype train, like we're full bore. And I think it's similar to what I said about Xavier Gilliam. Like, hey, let's go in the non-con, cut them loose against Nevada, FIU, and Villanova, and then we'll know a lot more about what Penn State has there.
Muted there for a second. Sorry, Daniel. So Coleman's the guy that we'll be watching closely. I think someone else we're curious about to a different extent is Anai White, because the intrigue there is that the former top 100 recruit, went and tried to, play his ball in the SEC. Spent a few years at Texas A&M. Injury was a big part of it. Didn't get to play a bunch of football. Now he's here. He's a redshirt junior. That clock's ticking, and he's playing defensive tackle after spending the last 3 years focused on defensive end with the Aggies. And White, according to Deion Barnes, that athleticism and the things that led him to the edge initially, they're more apparent now that he's inside. And James Franklin said that before. Maybe his athleticism was not going to carry him to success as an edge rusher at Penn State, but at 275 pounds, how does it translate when you're going inside, working against a different kind of athlete on the offensive line as well? And certainly Deion Barnes is cautiously optimistic. I think he wants to see how it plays out here. He's worked with Anai White for a long time. They have a history that goes back to Philadelphia, long before Anai White was here with Penn State, before Deion Barnes was defensive line coach here in Happy Valley. So I think there's a lot of trust in place between the two of them. He seems to think that there is really something here. And it sounds like he had to kind of pitch it to Anai White to keep his head on straight, because he said, not a lot of defensive ends want to go play defensive tackle willingly. But he's kind of said, when you look at what it could mean for Penn State's future, certainly what you look at what it could mean for Anai White's future and potentially his longevity as a player in the sport, he says they're on the same page now, and they're sinking their teeth into it. And so just a little bit of an update there. I know people have been curious about Anai White. We're not penciling him in as a big-time contributor this season quite yet, but we'll see what he can do behind the scenes. He's a week or two into his career as an interior defensive lineman. What did you hear on safeties? Because you got a chance to get over to Anthony Poindexter after our latest look at practice. And so I'm curious, because last time we talked about them, Jim Knowles was bringing Antoine Belgrave Shorter into that competition, along with Dejan Lane and King Mack to start next to Zakee Wheatley. So more of the same regarding that competition from Anthony Poindexter. Any new nuggets on young guys? What do you got for us?
I think something really interesting that Poindexter said was that he was asked about the depth behind Zakee Wheatley. And he framed it as they're trying to figure out who's going to start next to Wheatley. So you've got one guy entrenched, and then you've got a group of guys fighting for that other spot. And Poindexter said that he feels better about the depth that they have this year than they did last year. And I think that's something that we saw borne out when you had the KJ Winston injury. I think if you were to compare these rooms, that top line talent of Winston, Reed, Wheatley, you'll take that every year. I think when you look at a defense, but behind them, the King Mack transfer really hurt them. And so you had someone like Dejan Lane as the next guy up, maybe a little bit early for him. But I think this year you look at this group and you've got Wheatley experienced at the top. And then you've got a bunch of guys in their second seasons. Poindexter kind of jokingly referred to Mack as a redshirt freshman. Because he was gone last year, so this is really his second year at Penn State. But I think overall Poindexter seems really confident. He's doing the balance of getting these young guys ready to play versus what's best for their long-term development over the course of their career. You brought up Antoine Belgrave Shorter as someone that Jim Knowles mentioned, and Poindexter had really, really high praise for him. He said that Belgrave probably took the biggest leap. His growth has been really impressive. He can learn quickly. He's talented. Poindexter's excited. And so, he's learned how to practice, playing with urgency. I think we've heard really good feedback on Belgrave Shorter. I think going back to talking to Jalen Reed at the Fiesta Bowl. So I think that's someone whose arrow has maybe a little bit more on the quiet side, given that he wasn't necessarily the biggest recruit and he had a position switch a little more under the radar. I think he's probably one of the more quieter guys who's had his arrow pointed up over the course of the year. As for
Can I make a note on Belgrave Shorter real quick? Because he's a guy that we are going to get to know a lot more, I think, this year. I remember right before he enrolled, I was speaking to a couple people within our scouting department here at 247 Sports, and they have their eyes on everybody over the country, and sometimes they like to pick the minds of some beat reporters. He was asking me if Belgrave Shorter was going to play cornerback or safety when he got to campus. I said the read that we have from the staff is he's going to be a cornerback, and the feedback I got was like, he'd probably be a higher rated safety. That they would have been higher on him as a safety than a cornerback. And I knew that the staff at Penn State viewed him as a positional versatile guy. And so maybe you could forecast that Keaton Ellis is a Key Wheatley type transition that we have seen from cornerback to safety. But I figured that was worth bringing up because there were people who track defensive backs all across the country year by year by year. And a couple of them within our network was telling me that if they were able to convincingly label Antoine Belgrave-Shorter as a safety at the next level, they viewed it as a higher ceiling for him. So I figured I'd share that. I haven't shared it at any point, but this seemed like an appropriate moment to do it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think from like a more like intangible perspective, Penn State does everything pretty intentionally. And Belgrave-Shorter was one of the guys that we talked to after the blue-white game. So I think that it's not something to completely, take like, oh yeah, this is a big sign for his future. But I think that that's something that it shows that, he has the trust of the staff, and that someone who can be a voice can speak on different things. And I think that is just, another smaller positive to put, behind him, beyond what he can do on the field and his physical attributes. Poindexter said that they all will play. It's just they have to figure out who's going to be on the grass first. That's really what they're working on. He thinks they'll rotate. They can go 4 or 5 deep, but they don't necessarily know what order that's going to be in yet.
All right. Well, Poindexter always seems to come up with a good solution in that room when at the end of the day, by the end of the season, we feel pretty good about what he did at safety. I'm guessing we'll feel the same way. We'll see what that combination ultimately looks like over the first few matchups. Want to finish off in terms of our positional reviews here over at tight end, because did spend some time after that latest practice speaking with Ty Howell, tight ends coach, and Luke Reynolds, a sophomore, considered one of the more ascending figures in this offense after burning redshirt last year, starting 4 games, playing quite a bit with Tyler Warren and Khalil Dinkins. Ty Howell says this room reminds him a lot of the one he had in 2022, which, if you'll recall, was led by Brenton Strange statistically, but also featured Theo Johnson and Tyler Warren. So you've got a second-round pick, a first-round pick, and a fourth-round pick to the NFL, and all 3 of those guys playing a bunch of football in the league this fall. But they shared that group. It was the team that went to the Rose Bowl, and Ty Howell says, they feel like they have the same kind of system because 3 starting quality tight ends at the top of the conversation with Khalil Dinkins, Luke Reynolds, and Andrew Rappleyea. And with Rappleyea, you and I have both noted, I think Mark Brennan had done it as well, some other colleagues who've been watching practice. The first couple of looks at practice was a little bit rough for Andrew Rappleyea. You saw a guy clearly straining. You saw a guy wanting to be as aggressive as he could and passionate out there on the practice field, which is the MO for Andrew Rappleyea. But that wasn't the same dude that we saw tearing it up as a recruit, that we saw really pushing to play last year as a freshman. By all accounts, and specifically Ty Howell and Luke Reynolds, he really turned it up toward the back end of this camp. Second half, the last couple of weeks, looking a lot more like himself, rounding out into form. And Ty Howell said, just getting back to the Andrew Rappleyea that we know and love. And so for him to be developing that kind of confidence, I wasn't so sure earlier this month if they truly were going to have, really 3 starting quality tight ends. I thought maybe Andrew Rappleyea was going to have to be categorized on his own, but we'll see what the initial snap distribution looks like. Are they going to ease Rappleyea in? He was a starter last year in the season opener. They have loved him around this program for a long time, but it's just really tough to ignore right now, Daniel, the feelings around both Dinkins and Reynolds. Dinkins, hearing from Ty Howell compare his contested catch ability to Tyler Warren was a little eye-opening for me, because that's a hell of a contested catch ability, and we haven't seen the high volume for Khalil Dinkins where he's getting 6, 7, 8 targets in a single game, but he has been a reliable target when they looked in his direction, here and there, and on third, fourth downs in the red zone. And so we'll see what it looks like. But Luke Reynolds is obviously that person who brings such a high ceiling for himself, someone we could see being a first-round NFL draft talent at the tight end position based on projection. Does he kind of make that kind of an impression early and often this year where he can kind of elevate the potential of this offense? Or is it more of a flashes here, flashes there, and then we file him away for next year when he'll probably take a huge step forward? That's a good question, but I'm getting the sense they feel like they have at least 2 really good threats right now, and then they think Andrew Rappleyea is going to get right back there very soon. And so it's still 3 guys at the top and everybody else is developing conversation at tight end. What do you make of this going into the season? Because it's a little bit different than probably we anticipated, with Rappleyea being a little slow to get back up. And not slow, I don't want to say that, but just needing to take his time to get back up to speed. It feels like it's a little bit more category of Reynolds, Dinkins, and then we'll see what Rappleyea can do.
Yeah, I think at this point, August 21st, you feel a lot better about Andrew Rappleyea than you did on August 2nd, the first time that we got eyes on him. When Khalil Dinkins earlier this month was like, yeah, he's limping around out there, but is still going about his business. I think what we saw on Tuesday night at our look at him, really smooth. You can tell that he's more back, for lack of a better way to put it. So I think that's a pretty big positive. I think when you look at Luke Reynolds, it's really this is such a football coach answer, but I feel like it's really going to come down to consistency with him as he steps into a larger, more featured role. I think that Khalil Dinkins, while has always been in a little bit more limited role, I do think that the staff has seen that consistency from him when it comes to being a blocker, and then when his number is called on offense, delivering. I think with Luke Reynolds, that's what he's going to have to do now, is that, as a younger player, you're going to have to go out there and just stack these reps over and over again over the course of a game, in terms of, not missing assignments, being where you're supposed to be when your number is called, completing a play. I think that we all have faith that he can do all of that because we've seen the flashes and in his limited time. But I think in order to reach that ceiling that you talk about with him, that's what you're going to need to see. And I think that that's something with younger players, when they step into these bigger roles, more so than, the physical side or anything like that, you just have to see them do it over and over and over again. So I think with Reynolds, that's what pops into my mind first. And then I think with Rappleyea, it'll be something similar as he gets more playing time, as he gets worked in more, and has whatever role he is going to have.
All these guys, a lot of skills as receivers, highly respected as blockers as well in the run game. And I'm curious what this ends up looking like statistically. Obviously, none of them are going to be a 104 reception guy like Tyler Warren was. I just looked back at the 2022 stat sheet since Ty Howell kind of gave us a comparison there. Brenton Strange led the group, 32 catches, 360 yards, 5 touchdowns. Theo Johnson had 20 catches, 330 yards, 4 touchdowns. Tyler Warren, 10 catches, 123 yards, 3 touchdowns. I remember Warren turning some heads as a run blocker along the way back in 2022 as well. But we'll see. The other factor here is I think compared to last year, you're going to see more involvement with 3 wide receivers on the field, which would presumably mean less 12 personnel, less opportunities. And this is an offense that should be able to let the ground game dictate a lot of terms. And so I don't see Drew Aller throwing 40 passes week by week by week. And, so I don't know that the volume will be there for the tight end spot, but this is a group that I think will deliver whenever its number is called. And that's really what you're looking for. I think that's all we've got. And I say all we've got, that's about 50 minutes of stuff. And we have a lot more at lions247.com. Is there any other thing you wanted to include from our last look at preseason camp before we come back next week and shift focus toward getting ready for a game week?
I don't think so. It was I think a pretty loose group out there. I think that's been a common theme throughout camp. Obviously, we talk about it. There's a shift at this time of year, where once you get in the game week, the tone changes a little bit more, the approach changes a little bit more, and I think it's another real sign that you're really in it. But we're 9 days out right now. I think we have a good handle on what we're going to see when things finally get started. But yeah, it's been a productive couple of weeks, I'd say.
Yeah, the curtain goes up next Saturday, August 30th, and we'll get a chance to see these guys play 60 minutes of football. Like Daniel said, there has been a loose group, and that starting with James Franklin, going back to his trip to Las Vegas, it just they're doing their best to show you in their actions and their words that if there is pressure on this team, they're not necessarily living within it, and if they are, that they're handling that pretty well as the number 2 team in the country and the top-ranked team in the Big Ten. Our season predictions, by the way, are live. Our regular season record predictions. Will Penn State go 12-0 for the first time since 1994? We give you our answers. That's over at lions247.com. We'll bring that conversation to you in a podcast form early next week with Mark Brennan on board, and we'll talk a lot of big picture stuff as the season approaches. We also have our kickoff roundtable series ongoing over at linesto247.com. A bunch of topics we're bouncing around, fresh content as preseason camp closes. I'll have a story up on Chaz Coleman today, a story up on Andrew Rapplier. This week we have stories up on that quarterback competition, on Xavier Gilliam at defensive tackle. A lot cooking for you, and our game week coverage gets underway next Monday with the trip to Beaver Stadium media room for press conference with James Franklin. And we're off and running with our in-season podcast schedule. 50% off, by the way, still going on. Become a VIP subscriber at linesto247.com for half off going into this season while that lasts. Daniel, appreciate your perspective. It's been fun covering another preseason camp with you. Let's get into season action. I hope you enjoy your final weekend away from football because we are locked in coming out of it. We'll talk to you all real soon. On behalf of Daniel Gallen, I am Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 Podcast.